No. No, he shouldn't have. Thank you for watching. Bye bye, see you next time. Okay, let's do this properly, I guess. Hero Aka needs no introduction. You know the drill, superhero shonen, fantastic protagonist and villain, top one, nothing new here. It's also a series that, for some reason, attracts a lot of interesting and sometimes odd criticism and feedback, although I suppose that's inevitable with this much success and exposure. One of these points that keeps somehow coming up again and again is about the inciting incident of the series itself. As you certainly know, Hero Aka centers around Deku, a young boy who's born into a world of superpowers without a power of his own, Quirkless. This initial setup is altered when he meets his idol All Might, who reveals to him that he can pass on his power, which he promptly does, giving Deku access to the quirk one for all, blah blah blah. You know how it works. From this point onwards, the story unfolds, but some readers/viewers get hung up on this moment and cite it as a betrayal of the initial concept, saying that the story would have been better or more interesting if Deku had remained quirkless, and that him receiving a quirk ruins the narrative. I think, among all Hero Aka takes, this one is the most interesting to explore. Not because I agree with it, I don't, it's dumb, but because it can give us an insight into the nature of criticism and saliency, since this take keeps returning despite it being kind of obvious why it isn't very reasonable. So I thought we should go through a few aspects of this idea to see how and why this doesn't work as both a concept and a point of criticism. So for today, let's go through and try and imagine how this story would work if we remove One for All from the equation, and see the many hurdles we encounter and why this point of criticism might not be as reasonable as some of you may think. I want to get this one out of the way real quick because it is the easiest and dumbest aspect of this topic. The notion that Deku getting a quirk ruined the story is laughable, because it happens in chapter 2. There literally isn't a story to be ruined yet. Before Deku gets his quirk, all we really got was a prologue, so it's not like there was much substance presence that could have been besmirched by this plot element. Okay, so if it can't ruin the story that's already there, what about the story that could have been? Did Deku receiving a quirk ruin the path the story was meant to take? Well, how would you know? How would any of us know that a story about Deku not having a quirk would be inherently better than what we got? This is something I'm gonna say a lot today, but in criticism, it's essential to criticize what's in front of you, not what's in your head. Your feedback should be based on the text that exists, not the text you wish existed. And while ideas and ponderings can be useful and cool, criticizing something for ruining an imaginary version of the story it was simply never interested in telling in the first place is not exactly constructive in my opinion. Keep this in mind as we go on. Okay, with the stupid part out of the way, let's move on to another stupid part. Let's start by making Deku permanently quirkless. He never gets One for All. What now? Well, the story ends. All Might giving Deku a speech on heroism and giving him One for All were pretty much the miracle that saved Deku from his fate of irrelevance. He was pretty much ready to give up before All Might reassured him, so him not getting his quirk would just end the story prematurely. Okay, but we want a story, so in that case, let's give Deku a resilience streak, so that he keeps going even after All Might tells him no. Now, however, we have to change not just his character now, but his future arc. Deku's character progression in MHA, as it is in the actual manga right now, is all about him being blessed by sheer luck to reach his goals and then struggling with the guilt and inadequacy of having been given this privilege and opportunity while people like Shinso remain less fortunate. Deku's arc isn't about proving to others that he's worthy, it's about proving that to himself. For our restructured Deku here, who is a lot more feisty and a lot more resilient, this arc makes no sense, since A, he doesn't have a quirk to be blessed with anyway, and B, if our Deku has the mental fortitude to hear his idol reject him and keep going, he probably already has loads of confidence in his worthiness. So for our Deku, the arc would revolve around proving himself to others via hard work and never giving up, all while showing himself to be a lot more confident and a lot more feisty than the actual Deku we got. So, congrats! We have made Naruto. No, but joking aside, we have restructured Deku into what is pretty much a more stereotypical shonen protagonist, an underdog whose strong belief in himself pushes him to glory. Would that make for a better story? I don't know, maybe, sure, but at the very least, this setup is a lot more generic than how Deku is in the actual manga. Certainly, you'll agree with me that the feisty underdog with a bark he wants to back up with his bite is a lot more common and archetypical in shonen than the blessed neophyte whose luck gnaws at his self-worth in an arc about reconciling his own privilege. So, by removing One for All, we have turned Deku into a very different, a more generic, and, in my opinion, less interesting character. Alright. Let's move on and talk about moving on. Namely, how would the progression of a Quirkless Deku even work, power-wise speaking? After all, battle shonen do somewhat rely on the growth and progression of their main characters, and that includes their power sets and abilities. Since quirks are a no-go, the general idea of this alternative MHA story tends to revolve around Deku using tech gadgets and gizmos alongside physical strength to become a sort of Batman-esque crime fighter. Alright, bet, let's do that. And immediately we encounter a problem. Where is he getting his tech from? In order to compete in the world of heroes, and don't worry, we'll get to that world in a minute, he would need highly advanced technology, the kind that probably wouldn't be accessible to a 14-year-old nobody just like that. The way I see it, there are essentially two ways we can go about this. Either Deku is also a super genius who can just create this sort of stuff himself. But that kind of ruins his underdog position, not to mention also demolishes the believability of his character. A 14-year-old kid being a super mega genius, Jimmy Neutron style, who can outperform the tech of the world in order to compete with real heroes is kinda odd, and again, kinda goes against the kind of story we're trying to tell here. We're trying to make him less special. Or, option B, he partners up with someone ultra proficient in these sorts of things. Which, to be honest, just loops us back from where we started. If All Might choosing Deku to receive his immensely powerful quirk is an issue for you, then him being given access to cutting-edge tech by some science genius is probably not ideal either. However, this could be a way to bring Mei Hatsume into the main cast, and she is my wife, so I'll allow it. But we have a second issue here. We now have a way for Deku to compete with quirk users, but how do we progress him? One for All, despite its percentages and later spoilery additional mechanics, is a power that is simple to understand, which means that showing growth is pretty easy. Full cowling and shoot style are super simple to understand, but make perfect sense for the power. They're applications that are instinctively understandable to someone without any real additional explanation needed. Full cowling covers the entire body in the power, shoot style focuses the power on the legs. Super simple. When dealing with tech, however, this becomes difficult. The average fan isn't an engineer, so you can't exactly go too in-depth with how his gadgets would actually function on a granular level. However, because technology actually exists in our world, it has a basis in our understanding of what's feasible and what isn't, so you wouldn't exactly get away with giving no explanations at all. It would put you, as the writer, into a really tight spot, since going into detail will be more effort than it's worth, but not going into detail would raise more questions than you really want. Also, as the series is supposed to be long, eventually you'd probably run out of ways to progress his tech meaningfully anyways. At some point, when you're trying to fight against people like Shigaraki or Dabi, you are going to turn it into science magic anyway, which I think is kind of a shame. At that point, you might as well start out with magic, or, in this case, quirks. So far, we have changed our main character in personality, arc, and power quite drastically. But now, we must face probably the biggest hurdle of this little thought experiment: the world. The setting of any story is always intimately interlinked with that story's thematic needs and aspirations, so changing the main character as much as we have would surely necessitate changes to the setting as well. And sure enough, that is the case, since currently our new and restructured Deku would basically die day one. You see, when we compare the average level of power granted by quirks to the average level of feats by the technology of Hiraka's world, the former vastly eclipses the latter. Endeavor can turn into a supernova at will. Meanwhile, the most impressive thing Hero Tech has ever done is contain a fraction of All Might's power before breaking. It's called support gear for a reason. It is only there to support and enhance existing quirks, but by itself, it isn't really all that effective. Deku, only being equipped with the level of tech available in the current story, would never be able to live up to people like Endeavor and All Might. Sure, he obviously wouldn't have to fight those heroes directly to get to the top, but you gotta remember that the reason heroes need to be strong is to combat villains of equal strength. Do you think Deku could use the support gear we have seen in the story thus far to fight and defeat people like High End, Dabi, or Shigaraki? The answer is no, he couldn't, which is a problem considering the story is supposed to be about him becoming the greatest hero. It's just as All Might says, some villains you just cannot beat without a quirk. Obviously, hardship can be a great thing to infuse your story with, but there comes a point where hardship becomes so overpowering that the act of overpowering it becomes unbelievable and cheap. When you put too many hurdles in front of your characters, you get to a point where resolving those hurdles cannot be done in a way that will feel satisfying. We could call this the Madara effect, because of course, if you were around when the Naruto chapters were dropping back then, you remember that no one knew how the fuck they were gonna beat Madara, and when they finally did beat him, it was unsatisfying. So obviously, we gotta change something. We could just completely change Deku's main goal, but honestly, that is so drastic a change that I wouldn't even know where to go from there. So instead, let's do something safer and change the setting instead. We basically end up with two options. We either power up the average level of technology in Hiraka's world, or we severely decrease the average power of quirks. By either making technology more advanced and powerful, or making quirks less destructive and overpowering, we could get our quirkless new Deku into a power range that'd make his quest both interesting and feasible. However, and if you've been paying attention, I'm sure you know what I'm about to say, both of these options create issues. If we overpower technology, we run into a pretty serious question. Why doesn't everybody else use it then? If the average level of tech in Hiraka's world would allow it to compete with quirk users, why would there even be anything interesting about Deku using it to get to the top? He'd probably just be one of many trying to go down that route, and one of many to probably fail, since now he'd have to compete against not just quirk users, but quirk users with access to immense technology. It would, again, just end up making his rise to the top pretty unfeasible and unbelievable. As I said, you could bullshit your way through that, but that doesn't exactly sound like a great option, to be quite honest. The second option runs into a similar problem. Let's say we depower quirks to a point where a super fit Deku with the gadgets available in the current story could overthrow them. Not only do we run into the exact same issue as with the other option, removing the weight and adversity of Deku's journey since tech heroes will probably be pretty common, but it also creates an even bigger, more central problem. One of Hiraka's most fundamental thematic cores is the myriad of problems and injustices arising from the natural inequality created by quirks. But if quirks are weakened to the degree that a buff teenager with a pea shooter can outfight them, then a lot of those injustices become kind of insignificant. The weaker and less intrusive quirks are, the less relevant many of the societal issues in Hiraka become, since many of them hinge on the massive differences not just between quirk havers and have-nots, but between the insane amount of variety of possible quirks. The discrimination, the misunderstandings, the regulations and oppressions, all of these just aren't as believably important if quirks go from generally dangerous and often lethal to so weak that they can be overpowered by a fat biceps. And if you've ever heard me talk about MHA, you know that the societal world building is a huge part of it. It's something that informs the themes, the characters, and the plot itself. And fucking with that and making that less integral is a huge change, and one that would undoubtedly derail the story if not done with a lot of care. So what we end up with is a setting we have to change, which each way of changing it undermining other core aspects of the series. As I said, ideally we'd have to completely rewrite the setting entirely, but to be quite honest, YouTube doesn't pay me enough to do that to be worthwhile, so let's just move on. So, let's review what we've done. We have taken Hiroaka and, by changing the inciting incident, caused a massive rippling throughout the entire work that has changed it into something pretty much unrecognizable. Could our constructed concept be cool? Yes, I am of the opinion that almost any idea can work in writing if executed the right way by the right author. However, just looking at these two concepts, the Hiroaka that exists and the Hiroaka we imagined, the latter seems a lot messier and a lot more patched together, with a less interesting protagonist, an unclear path of progression, and a setting that is at odds with its own themes. In order to make this work, you'd have to keep changing more and more aspects, turning it into a completely different story entirely. Now, think back to what I said at the beginning. Criticize what's in front of you, not what's in your head. We have now constructed a completely different work in our heads. Would it be fair now to hold it against Hiroaka for not going down the specific path? Would it be reasonable to criticize it for not telling a story it simply was not interested in telling? A story that we imposed onto it based on our own preferences? Not really, in my opinion. It'd be kinda like running into a grocery store, looking at the apples, and then yelling at the manager because those apples suck at being oranges. They're just two very different things. We have changed so much at this point that we're talking about two completely different sets of ideas, even if we started from the same point. Whether or not it would have been cooler or better without One for All isn't really a factor, although we have explored that. The act of criticizing a work, not for what it actually tries to do, but for what you wanted it to do based on 2 chapters, is just not very constructive. Obviously, we all have our preferences, and obviously we're gonna have thoughts of, oh, I wish they did this could have been cool. But when talking about these things critically, you need to take a step back and try and properly think these things through. Taking One for All out of the equation sounds like a small change, but as we've illustrated, it changes a lot in the story just by implication and by association. So essentially, what you say when you say Hiroaka sucks because Deku got One for All is Hiroaka sucks because it didn't go down a very specific path I might not have planned for, but that I would have nonetheless implicatively preferred. And as I've illustrated, I don't think that's particularly fair, because it doesn't really help anyone. It informs us about what you prefer in stories, it informs us about what things you would like to see, but it doesn't really inform us on any level about the story we actually have. It doesn't tell us what the strengths and weaknesses, what the failings and successes of Hiroaka are, because we're not talking about Hiroaka, we're talking about a different story. So yeah, conclusion, Deku should have not stayed quirkless. Who would have thunk? MHA goated, top 1, top 1, top 1, top 1, top 1, top 1, top 1. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe and ring that goddamn bell if you liked it. You can find me streaming on Twitch or support me via Patreon or our new merch. Regardless of what you do, I love you and you know that. Take care, be safe, wash your hands, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.